Okay. Welcome, welcome. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. Thank you all for joining myself, Dr. Camila Oseguera, and my dear, super smart friend, Dr. Maha, for this webinar on internalized oppression. There's so many things that you could be doing on a Sunday morning, but you've decided that you want to join us in a conversation about what do we do with the kind of toxicity we take in, that we ingest, that we breathe, and the ways that it impacts our hearts, our minds, our spirits. And this is a conversation that we actually should be having quite frequently, and it's difficult to have. So we're hoping in the next 60 to 90 minutes, we're able to give you language and community and space and curiosity to think about how do we talk about something that is insidious, is all around us, it affects us, and also give us a sense of what we can do differently, right? White supremacy is not inevitable. Internalized oppression is not inevitable to the extent that I think that we are crushed by it. So we always have choices that we can make, and those choices are better made in community with like-minded folks. And so welcome. We're going to give folks just a few minutes to trickle in and join us. It is 10:34 in Chicago, and Dr. Maha, you are, where in the world is Dr. Maha these days?
I am in Arlington, Virginia, right by the Pentagon.
Ooh,
So,
fun.
a good place to talk about a lot of these ideas
Mhm.
and just also want to welcome you all. I'm really thrilled that you're here. Also, so honored to work with Dr. Camila. She is amazing and brilliant, and you should all follow her and Muslim Wellness Foundation. And just want to, put a plug also that, we know that these are really challenging, difficult, very strenuous, strange times. And there's a lot going on in the world. There's a lot to hold, there's a lot to mourn, there's a lot to be sad about. And so it's really hard to be doing the internal work, as well as what a lot of us are doing is the external work of social justice. So really want to, thank you for sharing this space with us.
Yes, yes, absolutely. An excellent reminder also to give ourselves just some grace, right? If you are like the two of us, last evening around 6 o'clock, we started getting all of these notifications about an event that happened in Butler, Pennsylvania. And if you are a member of communities that are impacted, right, by all kinds of news, but certainly what's now being called a presidential assassination attempt, or of a former president, one who's now currently running for reelection. Um, how many of us were holding our breath? Like, I hope the shooter is not Black, brown, Muslim, appears to be or perceived to be Muslim, right? Like, this is what happens, right, when these events occur. Um, Whether or not we realize it, we're holding our breath and we're waiting, right? And then, right, as I was speaking with another friend via text, um, also waiting on what will be a counter narrative of, here's a mentally unwell, young white male who's frustrated with America, and we should have empathy for him. And so we're well aware of the ways that we are experiencing the world and what it does, right? Whether there's tension, there's stress, there's even feelings of like apathy or numbness. Those are all to be expected. It's normal, right? We're like flooded and overwhelmed with so much information, but also information that we know is going to impact our communities. So we're not going to solve all of it today. We wish we could. If we had secret sauce to like end white supremacy in this webinar, I mean, um, we'd give it to you. We just, because capitalism. But we're gonna strive. We're gonna try. We're gonna be together, and we're gonna breathe. We're gonna learn, um, and we're just gonna keep doing the best we can. All right.
Yeah, I want to thank you also just for bringing up that particular context because I think One of the things I've been talking about with my friends is the way that they're referring to whatever this incident was as political violence.
Yes.
And that's a very specific construct, and they're using it to suggest that what the United States is doing in other countries, including the enabling of Israel's genocide, is
Yes.
somehow not political violence.
Right.
And so the way that that adds layers of violence to the violence we're already experiencing, right? Because they can so easily dismiss a
Yeah.
genocide that, at minimum 40,000 people, 40,000 Palestinians have been killed.
Yes.
And so it's just really incredible, right, to see the hypocrisy and how visible, right, and explicit it is, and to really have to sit with that.
Yes. Yes. And also to again think about this forced choice position, right, that we're in, that is either Democrats or Republican. We're kind of going off on a tangent. This is a little commentary before we but
Our podcast.
we're now again forced to witness, right? One party saying, "Oh, this is reprehensible. This is horrendous. We should, condemn all kinds of political violence." And where's the condemnation, right, for the ways that both parties are complicit in the violence that happens both abroad and very, very locally?
Mhm.
And so, it's just if you're on social media, take a little bit of a break. But I have to say the commentary, especially on Twitter, is very interesting. I think it also brings to light like the ambivalence and sort of the conflict, right? And the hypocrisy that many of us observe, right, when these kind of things occur. Um, so, Dr. Maha, you ready to get started?
Yeah, let me just say one quick thing, which is, I've seen a couple of organizations, BIPOC organizations, actually respond
Mm,
Trump being shot and saying, like, we offer our condolences and things like that. And it's very interesting because in
mm,
cases of violence against our own communities, they've remained silent.
yes,
So to connect to this particular webinar, right, it's like, whose violence do we actually challenge and what violence are we going to stand up against? And when we don't stand up against the violence directed at our own communities, what does that mean we have to do? So that's a good segue into our webinar.
thank you. All right. And remember, we're going to remind you to breathe. It's early, it's Sunday, right? And there are so many things that are happening in our personal lives, and we're trying to understand, we're trying to make sense of the world and sort of where we are in it. And this is not an easy thing to do. So we're inviting you to essentially like just be gentle with yourself, acknowledge the ways that you're harmed, and also that even joining this webinar, this conversation is a choice, right? A choice that you've decided to make. And we think it's a good one. All right. So we wanted to begin with this idea of, who taught you to hate yourself? And before we begin with that, wanted to give you a sense of where we're going, right? What is the conversation going to be like? What are we going to share with you? And at this point, it is also an invitation to give yourself permission to be present or not, right? If this is sort of the general direction that we're going in today, perhaps you think about sort of your own capacity emotionally, mentally, psychologically. You're like, I don't know if I'm ready for that on July 14th, at 10:35 in the morning. And that's okay, right? So often we don't receive an invitation to consent, right? To the information that we've received. We don't give ourselves permission. We just feel like we have to be there or we're obligated to. And here is what we hope will be a really good journey for us this morning. And if you decide, I don't know if I have it, that's okay. That is perfectly fine. You can do the best you can, or you can exit when you feel the time is right for you. So we're first going to invite you. Again, our minds, I don't know how many tabs you have open in your brain, Dr. Maha, but I know I have a lot all the time. And so this is a reminder for me as well, that wherever I am, that's the only place I can be. And so it is a gift to myself when I decide to be where I am, because there's no other place that I can be physically, but also mentally and emotionally, right? I want to be here. I want to be with you. And so this is another invitation. Be here now. 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 So if you decide that you want to go on this journey with us and you want to be here now, I think it's a good use of your time. And you can always decide to do something different if that's also feels better for you. So take another deep breath, right? So much of what we ingest, of the toxins of oppression, of racial trauma, it robs us so much of these memories, right? Of just being able to play outside, of being able to enjoy, right? Just the innocence of childhood. And these are all things that we can mourn, but that we can also reclaim, right? Even in just our memories, right? Just remember what it was like to blow bubbles outside, right? Or for me, it was like playing hopscotch on the sidewalk. It was jumping double dutch, like just those moments that remind you of something good, but also you are not often what is expressed in the media as to who you are, who your communities are, who your family is, because you have these moments, right, that make you smile, that make you sort of think of moments of joy. So we're going to do a little bit of an introduction. It'll be pretty short and brief, but to give you a sense of why she and I, Dr. Maha and I, come to this work and what it means for us. So we actually know each other in real life. We're not just sort of like colleagues and, we're coming together to do a professional webinar. I love Dr. Maha. She's great. She's funny. She's like the quirkiest, like most intelligent person that I know. And so we actually, yes, we do know each other in real life. So this is us. And what I love about the fact that, Allah, the creator, saw fit for our paths to cross, is that we both bring a perspective that enriches certainly me and our work together. So I think of all of what I can share of my CV or my training, right, as a clinical psychologist, what is most important to me and is often like top of mind is that I am a descendant of enslaved people in the Caribbean and the US. And I am also a descendant of free people. My fourth great grandparents, Joseph Edrington and Marianne Ross, were agents on the Underground Railroad in Rising Sun, Indiana. And so that information, that history, that legacy is part of the why of what makes this so compelling. Why have I devoted so much of my life's work to talking about oppression, but also freedom and freedom seeking and what it means to really strive for liberation in whatever form that means for myself, for my community, for my family. Because I'm also a descendant of enslavers, of colonizers. And so it's a constant process of wondering, right, what happens as a person with this particular ancestry, with this particular legacy, who is striving now as a Black, Afro-Caribbean, African-American Muslim woman to think about freedom and freedom from oppression and just joy and liberation for my people. That's all relevant and also part of who I am and why I'm here. So Dr. Maha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Camila. And I can't say enough about my love for Dr. Camila. I mean, if you're in her presence, you will just like come to love her. She, has so much grace, thoughtfulness, intention, calm. Like if you're feeling anxious, go talk to, I mean, not that I know Dr. Camila has a lot on her plate, but just like gives me such a sense of calm and just her brilliance and just, everyone she brings together is just, phenomenal. So I'm just so honored and privileged. And, I told her yesterday, I'm like, I wish she would have been one of my professors when I was doing my PhD. Um, so, I come through this work slightly differently. My parents were immigrants from Egypt. And, when you're thinking and talking about immigration, technically my parents were, voluntary immigrants. But the older I got, the more I started to question what that actually means, because my family's from Egypt, and the Egyptian economy, Egyptian society has really been pretty hard, right, and difficult for many decades. And so, what does it mean to live in this country? And when I was growing up, my parents were very grateful to the United States, and that's not unusual, right? They came to this country, their lives were made easier. But the older I, grew and like the more politicized I became and the work I got into in terms of, challenging US state violence, it was just interesting at first to just talk with my mom in particular about like, her experiences and her telling me, well, you would never be able to do this kind of work in Egypt without facing severe repercussions. So just kind of having that in the back of my mind, and this kind of just propelled the work that I have done. And I got into it actually because I had met a really good Palestinian friend of mine who could not return to Palestine, and so that was sort of my entry into this work. And then started just learning more about the war on terror as I was in my master's and PhD program, and really thinking in particular about survivors of state violence, and survivors of Guantanamo in particular, and torture, and just a way also, just quickly, just to connect back to this webinar is, who does the Muslim community come out and support, and who do they not come out and support? And obviously that's not just something limited to Guantanamo, but the ways that our, different parts of our communities are constructed, right? Who's constructed as the bad, evil, criminal terrorist, and whose image and construction are we willing to challenge? And what does that say about the ideas that we've internalized ourselves? So, I think our perspectives are really a good combination, me and Dr. Camila. And I think you'll see throughout the presentation how our approaches and experiences really complement each other.
Yes, absolutely. And we're cute. So we'll just try to keep it light. Uh, so my organization, excuse me, Muslim Wellness Foundation, is an organization that I established in 2011. So almost 15 years of thinking about just the emotional health, the psychological well-being, the spiritual health of American Muslims in particular, and what is needed. What are some of the ingredients, right, that the community needs and needs to understand in order to think about holistic well-being, right? So not simply focusing, right, on stigma reduction when it comes to mental health, right? That's a part of it, but really, the core work of Muslim Wellness Foundation is to think about the impact of oppression and Islamophobia, anti-Muslim bigotry, white supremacy. How are all of these things also impacting how we think about ourselves, how we love ourselves or not? And when we're thinking about what is the antidote, what is the remedy, right? What are some of the solutions? Many of the answers, right, that we come to all involve a transformed understanding of self-identity, right? Like what do I come to believe about myself because of the world? And also, what does my faith, my sort of cultural background, what are all of the treasure that I can mine from who I am that can serve as the antidote to those things that I take in that really poison my spirit? And so we have been, for all of these years, really a leader and helping people understand that, yes, we can talk about individual vulnerability. We can talk about even sort of the genetic components, right? Like this is when we're talking about mental health and psychological well-being, we do take a holistic approach. And so we say, let's do all of the above, right? Let's find a therapist. Let's think about community. Let's think about a change in our diet. But let's also think about how we understand oppression, right? Systemically, and then the ways that it filters down to the individual level. And again, the decisions and choices that we can make, because white supremacy is not inevitable, right? We're made to believe that it's just overwhelming, it's everywhere, we can't do anything, we're helpless. And this is false, right? This is part of the master narrative. But when we're thinking about our health and our psychological health in particular, what do we need to understand about who we are? And that the creator has made us exactly as we should be, right? The creator has made something beautiful. And we want to connect with that beauty despite, right, what is part of the cultural narrative, what is part of our experience as minoritized people. We know the creator made us beautifully, and we want to connect with that simple fact. So Dr. Mahad, tell us about Muslim Counterpublics Lab.
So the mission of Muslim Counterpublics Lab is to disrupt and subvert dehumanizing narratives that are designed and deployed to justify state violence against Muslims. And, I think in the work that I've done, one of the things that really stands out to me per the mission is really the role of narratives, right? If the state wants to deploy state violence, one of the best ways to do that is to create an infrastructure through which it can demonize and dehumanize, our communities. And there's sort of this official narrative, and we're all familiar with it, right? Who are Muslims? We're terrorists, we're criminals, right? Islam is uncivilized, we're barbaric, all of these things. And the problem is that when we respond to these narratives, and which also gets into this webinar, right? A lot of times we're responding in ways that reiterate this master and dominant narrative, right? So if the state says Muslims are terrorists, our response is, no, we're not. We're good citizens. We pay our taxes, right? And so you're not fundamentally disrupting the status quo of what that narrative is. And so the goal and the mission of MCL is to really create and chart a path forward where we're not always responding, right? Where we can tell our stories outside of, and I'll use Dr. Camila's language, right? These toxins in the narrative, right? Where we don't always have to respond to this problematic narrative about who we are or who we aren't, right? We can tell our stories on our own terms while also disrupting explicitly the status quo and the ways that state violence is allowed to thrive.
That's right. That's right. So before we sort of get more into the meat of the webinar, again, these are all points that we want to invite you to give yourself permission to make a choice, right? That if you're engaged and present and you want to continue, it's setting an intention about how you do that in a way that's fair also to your mind and spirit. So these are just a few questions that I've sort of gathered over the years and helping in setting that intention. And again, it's an invitation, right? It's you deciding without judgment, right, how you want to be. So what kind of experience do you want to have? How much risk you want to take? If you have doubts or reservations, you're like, I'm not really quite sure where this is going or how it impacts my life, but I'm curious. How engaged or vulnerable do you want to be, like with yourself? These questions, like, forgive me, I'm a psychologist, they're diagnostic, right? They give you information. But often when we ask ourselves sometimes these reflective questions, we do it with this like really a tinge of like condescension and judgment, right? Like, well, why am I not being open? And I should be more vulnerable. It's like, no, you should just be and breathe. And so when you're like, well, I'm not feeling very open, or I have a lot of doubts, I'm not quite sure, it's just being able to assess where you are, right? And say, now can I be curious about where I am and why? But I do want you to think about how these questions live for you as we continue. And in particular, thinking about the story you hear yourself telling, right, about yourself, right? When you're asked to introduce yourself, depending on the context, right? Are you in a room full of other BIPOC folks, right? Are you in a room with not only people who are people of color, but also religiously minoritized? Does that change the way you tell your story? If you're in a predominantly white space, what do you reveal about yourself or feel compelled to disclose? Right. So let's, as we talk about this stories that are told and the narrative and how they fit within oppression, think about the stories you tell of who you are. And then I want you to also think about the gifts that you have, right? That you don't always fully acknowledge, either in that disclosure or in your introduction, right? Because again, this is one of the consequences of oppression is that we feel so diminished, right? Whether we are consciously aware of that or not, that feeling of being diminished, of feeling small, of feeling unworthy sort of sits somewhere, right? Like in your chest. And so we have to think about our gifts, our strengths. And I'll say, just sort of like as an aside, I have a kind of ambivalent relationship to this word that we use often called resilience, because that often, again, puts the onus on marginalized people to somehow be strong, right? To sort of stand up and bounce back in the face of, and no, it's like, stop oppressing me. I don't want to have to be resilient, right? Like I will survive because that's what my people have done, but we want to thrive. We want to just exist and be and laugh and love and do those things without constantly being under the threat of this violence. So what gifts, what strengths, what do I appreciate about who I am and the people, right, that I'm from? And not always feeling like we have to be sort of the symbol or embodiment of resilience in the face of this. It's just, I have a gift and I'm proud of that gift and I want to share it with others. So breathe. Another reminder, right? We have to. It is all around us and we have choices that we can make, right? However difficult they may seem, they are choices. So we can choose to breathe because we can. There's someone right now in the world under threat of violence. And we know this, again, both in the US and abroad, in particular, thinking about our family in Gaza, in Sudan, in Congo, in Haiti, right, in Somalia, and all of these different places, the Uyghurs of China. Like we're thinking about so many people who cannot breathe. We can, right? In this moment, we can decide. So breathe deeply, right? Without apology. You have the right. So context matters. What is around us, right? What are we taking in? What do we see? What sort of frames those things that come to our immediate awareness and those things that feel really out of touch or invisible? So we want to pause and, some folks have asked like, where did this, who taught you to hate yourself? Where did the name of even sort of this talk come from? And it's from a speech. Was that you wanted to add, Dr. Maha?
Oh, no.
Okay. It comes from a speech given by Malcolm X in LA on May 5th, 1962. And in response, right, his speech was in response to, again, context, recent events related to police brutality. So I'm going to play this really, it's about an hour. The full length speech is available online and we can send you the link, but I want to play just this clip.
Who taught you, please? Who taught you to hate the texture of your head? Who taught you to hate the color of your skin to such extent that you bleach to get like the white man? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose and the shape of your lips? Who taught you to hate yourself from the top of your head to the soles of your feet? Who taught you to hate your own kind? Who taught you to hate the race that you belong to? So much so that you don't want to be around each other. No, before you come asking Mr. Muhammad, does he teach hate? You should ask yourself, who taught you to hate being what God made you?
So I think that's a really sort of beautiful illustration of when we start to ask questions, right? Like what is happening, right? How have we come to hate our own skin, to hate the fullness of our lips, of our noses, of the texture of our hair. How did that happen? Right. And so he does go on to say, like, here are things that are happening in the world that are violent, that are destructive to us. Yet we are being cast, right, as those who are violent, who are destructive. And so I want us all to pause here and think about one, first, what came up for you just listening to those words, right? Who taught you to hate yourself? The texture of your hair, right? The shape of your nose, the color of your skin, your own kind. What comes up for you listening to those questions? So let's pause here for about a minute. Dr. Maha, what usually comes to mind for you when you hear this?
I think what comes to my mind is just like the way that he's sort of flipping the script. Because it's like we're supposed to accept this idea that, we're the people that hate, right? They talk about Muslims hating a lot. And in reality, it's the oppressors that are actually the ones that are hateful, that are teaching us to hate ourselves. And so I really appreciate that because it's like also Malcolm X was very revolutionary and really making people think about who gave you these ideas, right? Because as you're saying, right, they're not natural. And in order to sort of unlearn all of these, horrible things you have come to absorb about yourself, your identity, you have to know what those are, right? You have to know who taught you that. So I really appreciate this, the idea of like flipping the script. And it actually reminds me of this clip from, I don't remember the movie, but it was like, it's a very famous like Angela Davis clip when she was in prison. And the reporter's asking her about like, does she condone violence? And similarly, I know you know this one, right? It's like similarly, it's like flipping the script. What are you asking me about violence? You're asking me about violence when it is the state that is violent. So again, it's like this idea that we're empowered enough, right, to be able to push back because we refuse to believe what we're being told about ourselves. Oh, you're on mute.
And that you can always ask a question, right? Like, just, you don't have to have the answer.
Right.
Or maybe you're really unsettled by what comes up when you start to ask those questions, but that's fine too. But asking, like, what have we been taught, right? Because this also makes me think about colorism within our communities, right? Fairer skin, right? Being taught, like, oh, you got so dark, you got, right? Like in the summertime, because I cover, sometimes I often have like this line, right? Where like I'm like dark right here. And then if I, take my Kimar back, you could see the difference in my complexion. But even that sort of bringing something up, right? I know many of us in our communities been told, like, don't play outside in the sun, like, don't get too dark, or seeing, witnessing, or even experiencing preferential treatment, right, around skin color, around straightness of hair, or if your nose is small and thin, or, all of these things. It's like, how is that taught, right? And I think what becomes really confusing at the very least is that it appears that the people who love us, who are closest to us, are teaching us that. They're the ones from whom we're receiving messages around, being fairer is better, or having straight hair, or having lighter eyes. Like, but when we're thinking about the context, it's who taught them that, right? How is the culture developed, right? It's particularly in places where we can see the effects of, of colonialism, right? Of imperialism. Where is that happening and why? what function does it serve, right? Who benefits from that? So we can always ask questions, right? Like this does not obligate us to have the answer to each one, but we can say, why is that? Right? And maybe just asking the question makes us maybe a little angry. Why is that, right? And does it have to be so? Right. So, as you know, as Muslims, we believe that we are sort of born into the world in this sort of fitra, this natural state, right, of innocence and goodness. Um, and you know, when I sort of visually think of what this means for our ability to breathe and to be present, it's that we have this capacity, right, for something so beautiful, right, and to blossom into human beings that you know ideally receive nourishment and affirmation and validation in the world. Unfortunately, right, the world that we live in, when we think about white supremacy and just all kinds of marginalization and being minoritized, right, like we're very careful, right, in particular about the language that we use. I'm not a minority, right? I'm a member of the global majority. Um, and there's an experience, right? When we talk about being minoritized, that is also pushing us to ask, well, who's doing that, right? Ask questions. And so the toxins that we take in are all around us and impact us. And there's a term for this, right? So part of our what we want to impart like during this webinar is like language to help describe dynamics and phenomenon that we experience. And social toxicity is one of them, right? The extent to which there are threats in our environment that impede our ability to develop in healthy ways, right? In full ways. And it's not just on the individual, but the family and community as well. I think I just saw a question. Did you see a question, Maha?
Yeah, it looks like Mariam has a question.
Okay.
Is her hand raised?
I think I just, can you put that either in the Q&A or in the chat, Miriam, and then we can come back to it? Okay. So these are just some examples. This is not an exhaustive list, right, of social toxins. But again, what is the poison in our environments, in our context that impact us in negative ways? We can add to this list, right? But these are just, you know, again, to get us thinking and asking questions about what happens, right? When we start to look at the world differently and think about what is helping me grow and what is stunting my growth. So breathe. So we know that the toxins are present all around us and we breathe, right? We breathe. So we want to start with providing like a really brief definition of white supremacy, right? And Neely Fuller is an African-American scholar who said, if you do not understand white supremacy, what it is and how it works, everything else that you understand or think you understand will only confuse you, right? So this is like, we want to start with, how do we define what we're experiencing? How do we give language to it? How do we pull it out of what it seems to be, this is my fault, I'm bad, something's wrong with me, to there is a system designed to crush me, right? And I need to know how that system operates. So he wrote a book called The United Independent Compensatory Code System Concept, or Counter-Racist Code, right? So we have always been thinking about, how do we counter, right, what is around us, but not inevitable. So white supremacy, this is one definition from Dismantling Racism Workbook. It's the idea or ideology that white people and the ideas, right, not just white people, but the ideas, the thoughts, the beliefs, and actions of white people are superior to people of color and their ideas. It is also a political and socioeconomic system where white people enjoy structural advantage, right? So this is not just, oh, you know, white people think that they're smarter, right? There are structural advantages, and that the rights that other racial and ethnic groups do not, both at a collective and individual level. So this goes includes, but is not limited to, like a microaggression. Oh, somebody called me a slur. Okay, that is an individual experience, but there is a structure that supports being diminished on multiple levels if you're a person of color. So this is another way to sort of visualize, right, the levels of white supremacy, of how it's normalized, how it's present. And unfortunately, we tend to sort of just think about white supremacy on this sort of top level here, right? It's like when we're thinking about like, what are the examples I can point to, right? It's, oh, of course, if somebody is burning a cross on a lawn, yes, right? And it also comes in these really subtle, right, insidious ways that we also must pay attention to, because it happens like on a collective level, and also systemically. I'm not sure if we can change the chat settings now, but the Q&A should still work. So feel free, we'll check that along the way as well. Okay. So oppression and white supremacy is in the air we breathe, right? We're talking about context, we're talking about social toxins. It poisons all of us, right? And what we're trying to understand is like, to what degree have I been harmed by this toxin? In other words, if you've ever tried to eat a powdered donut, right? And this one just so happens to be from a company called Imperial Sugar. If you've ever tried to eat a powdered donut and it's good, maybe it's not actually my favorite, but it gets everywhere, right? It's on your face, it's on your hands, it's on your clothes, and you're trying to like wipe the crumbs right off your shirt. It just gets everywhere. It doesn't, no matter how neat and meticulous you try to be, right? It just gets everywhere, okay? Maybe you're trying to stay away from sweets. That's not your thing. How many people love this Nature Valley crunchy granola bars? I mean, not my favorite, right? Is it possible to open up one of these granola bars without getting all of the crumbs in your lap? If you've been able to do that, please tell us what the secret is, right? But again, like white supremacy, and this is the analogy that we're making, it just gets everywhere. So it's not, sometimes the question we ask is like, well, that's not fair, that's not right. Like, how is that? Well, it is, right? And once we're able to accept, like, this is part of the reality, right? We still have choices to make. So despite our best efforts, right? The powdered sugar gets everywhere. We're trying to be healthy. We're on our diet. We're doing well. No more sugar. But then we get a granola bar, right? But it still crumbles everywhere. And this is much like what we're trying to express about white supremacy. It is everywhere, right? And so once we know this, right, what can we do differently? And so the way all of the structures of oppression, the stories that we understand about ourselves, how the toxins impact us, is through these master narratives, right? Stories told by the oppressor to justify domination and violence, right? It's ubiquitous. It tolerates exceptions, right? Which is why you can have someone like Condoleezza Rice, right? Dr. Maha's shaking her head. I don't want to get you started. But it's like, oh, she speaks Russian and she plays piano and she's right. She's all of these exceptions and, right? You can have someone like Kamala Harris. You can have all of these exceptions that are used to say, oh, well, there are some good ones, right, who conform, right, who can sort of speak this language well. But in general, there's a master narrative that still governs, right, how people are perceived. These stories masquerade as explanations for why minoritized people deserve mistreatment. And they're so powerful, even when they are false, they still retain some hold over us. And these stories assimilate opposition, right? Because of all of this ways of deflecting, right? Like, well, let me play devil's advocate, right? Or we need you to be a perfect victim, right? We need you to be a voiceless, perfect victim of white supremacy in order to get any modicum of empathy, right? So these are the stories told by the oppressor. And to hold a people in oppression, John Henrik Clarke says, you have to convince them first that they are supposed to be oppressed, right? And this is what we take in. So much of the master narrative, it says, oh, this is their rightful condition. They're supposed to be receiving this kind of treatment. They are actually unworthy of anything different than what they are currently receiving. And it would be to the detriment of the world if they were treated better, right? This is the toxin that we take in. So this is just a brief sort of depiction, right, visually of how oppression operates, right? So notice the stages, right? Also from Dismantling Racism workbook. To forget, right? The oppressed must forget, right? Because we're here, right? To hold a people in oppression, you first have to convince them that they are supposed to be oppressed. So how does this happen? By forgetting, right? Forget what has happened to you historically and presently, right? And then this lie that's told, right? Stop speaking the truth. The truth has consequences. No one will believe you anyway, right? And if you look around the world, even if you speak the truth, it doesn't matter, right? This is the kind of messages that we take in. And then how do we cope, right, with those messages, those lies? Is to become numb, just to survive. Just live your life, don't feel, cut yourself off, right? And then you internalize the oppression. Maybe you start to think, it's my fault. I haven't worked hard enough. I'm not smart enough. I'm not pretty enough. I'm not tall enough. I'm not thin enough, right? I'm too dark. We internalize these messages. And then finally, the oppressor is not physically present, right? We've taken in all of those negative, corrosive messages, and we lose our sense of power, right? And begin to identify with the dominant group or the oppressor. So we want to play this brief clip from a film called An Act of Worship. And it illustrates how, again, we sometimes think about the very dramatic, extreme examples of how oppression shows up in our lives, but it can also be you in first grade and second grade, drawing, learning, right? And the teacher says something really odd. So I want to play this. Okay.
I was 10 years old. Operation Desert Storm in Iraq was going on. My sister and I would get up on Fridays and dress in our shalwar kameez and wear a headscarf. Our mom would pick us up early from school to attend Jummah prayer at the mosque. And she would wait at the back entrance all the way across the playground. It seemed like an eternity to get from the school building to the back fence where my mom was. And there was this kid, Ross. He and these two other girls would chase us, basically tormenting us, calling us Saddam Hussein's children. There was this one time where he threw a basketball at us and it hit me straight in the head. It made me feel really small and so low and so hurt and not understanding why we were being subjected to this. We spent that year, every lunch and recess, just kind of hiding out from them. We would hide behind these portable classrooms and have our lunch there just to feel a little sense of safety. But when my parents tried to intervene, they spoke to my teacher, who I really liked, but then she asked us, why do you have to be so different? And that was when we stopped wearing our shalwar kameez to school, wearing our scarves. And pretty soon after that, we stopped going to Jummah prayer altogether. That was when I started distancing myself, not just from my religious identity, but even my Pakistani identity. Just trying to blend in as much as I could, but not realizing that um, it would never be enough, and that I really didn't need to, that I shouldn't have had to.
So breathe. At some point, right? Either perhaps we've witnessed something like that happen to someone we know or we love, or it has happened to us, right? Some moment where, you want to shrink and hide because of what you're experiencing related to your identity. And the conclusion that you may draw, maybe this is in your 10-year-old mind, is something is wrong with me, right? And that is the master narrative that begins to take over. So it brings us to understand, right, what happens when we're flooded by those kinds of messages all around us. It's the adults, right, the teachers, right, that contribute to this. It's not just the children who are bullying or, calling names, but it's in the magazines, it's in the TV shows, it's in every message that you receive on so many different levels. What happens to us, right? And again, when we're trying to understand this, we breathe, because also what comes up is possibly anger, right? It's not like nobody ever explained this to me, right? Or perhaps something happened in school and I never told my parents because they had so many other things to worry about. And I didn't want to be a crybaby, right? I didn't want to, make them worried. So I never told anybody about these little incidents that just cut me and made me feel ashamed. Dr. Maha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Camila. That clip was really poignant and really powerfully illustrates a lot of, what we're talking about here. So there are a lot of, definitions about internalized oppression. And, this is one of the definitions. I won't read it verbatim, but that stood out to me, Dr. Camila. And you can see, in the highlighted yellow portion in the middle, it talks about what it really is about, right? Self-hatred, self-concealment, feelings of inferiority, resignation, isolation, powerlessness, and gratefulness for being allowed to survive. I think you could see in that clip, right? A lot of those feelings, right? Inferiority, resignation. We're not going to the fighter prayer anymore, right? We're going to shed our Pakistani identity. We sort of feel powerless to push back against this because what are the consequences, right? We continue to feel like others in this environment that we have to spend so much time in. And we'll kind of go through other aspects of what this looks like and really think about and see what does it mean to have gratefulness, right? Like to me, that's one of the most shattering and problematic ideas, is that we exhibit these ideas that we should be grateful to be allowed to exist. Do you want me to run through this or you want to go through? Okay. So these are just some of the ways that internalized oppression, right, shows up. And the idea is that it's not, it's not always a thing that you consciously embrace, right? A lot of this is unconscious. And you have to know what its manifestations are to really be able to address it, right? A lot of the ways that I talk about it and we talk about it is this devaluation of your own group, right? So there's the ways that it manifests internally, right? You might hate the way you look, right? The color of your skin, the texture of your hair. You might also, right, look at others within your group in a condescending way. You might treat them differently, right? Because you believe what the dominant group has told you about these individuals with whom you share an identity. And it's, really something that is so visceral and so entrenched that a lot of times it's going from generation to generation because it's being left unquestioned, right? And, what I really love about the work that we're doing together, me and Dr. Camila, is that, we're doing this work in the Muslim community, right? And theoretically, it should be a space where we feel safe, right? But we know that's not the case because there's a lot of anti-Blackness. There's a lot of xenophobia, right? There's a lot of these different oppressions that operate within, and is another way of understanding the ways that internalized oppression is entering into the equation, right? And how do we use these ideas and embrace these ideas to then inflict violence on people in our own communities, right? And so just really thinking about all of the ways it's manifested internally, externally, right? And it has an impact on your mental health, right? When you're constantly being positioned in the world as someone who's inferior, right? That you have to go out into the world and constantly prove yourself. I'm not a terrorist, right? I do like democracy. All of these things, right? It takes a toll on you.
So this is another way of sort of thinking about internalized oppression and specifically the harm and the damage that it causes us through the master narrative. So this idea of an infiltrated consciousness, right? Even sort of the term itself, right, is to make your skin crawl a little bit, right? This idea that there's almost like this parasite, right, in your brain that's eating at it, right? That's trying to very deliberately harm you and erode your ability to be as healthy as possible. And when we're feeling diminished, when we're feeling a sense of hatred, right, towards ourselves or people who look like us, it's often because that master narrative has been normalized. And what I mentioned in a chapter called Racialized Faith, co-written with another just brilliant scholar, D.L. Stewart, is talking about how, just what Dr. Maha mentioned, that now we have to overcompensate, we have to prove, we have to think about the ways that we can convince the oppressor that we are in fact human, that we are in fact worthy. And this often happens through these extraordinary acts of patriotism, right? Like this moral sacrifice, and often to appease white Christian American values, right? So, and is demanded of us, right? Prove your humanity, prove your innocence, and it comes through in the ways that we show up, specifically as religiously minoritized people of color, where you have racial and religious marginalization happening at the same time. And this is done to appease, often subconsciously, the potential for violence from the dominant group, right? So if I just prove I'm not a threat, I'm one of the good ones, right? They'll be less likely to be dangerous towards me, right? And we know that this does not work, right? It's a survival tactic, often demonstrated, right, or used by people of color, but it doesn't work, right? Because embedded in that tactic is the belief that we are inferior, unworthy, and if we can prove otherwise, then maybe I'll be accepted, right? It never works, right? That's the spoiler alert, right? It doesn't work ever. So take another deep breath. Dr. Maha?
So one of the ways we, wanted to also address internalized oppression is through this idea of colonial mentality. And this idea comes from ethnic studies, and in particular from work on and research within the Filipino American community. And if you know anything about, the sort of the history of the Philippines, they had experienced hundreds of years of colonization. And so this idea of colonial mentality is about, one, the ways in which you look at yourself, right? There's a denigration of the self, right? Two, this denigration of one's own culture. Again, these are ideas that we saw, right, in the clip that Dr. Camila just showed. Three, right, this idea of you sort of discriminate against people within your own group that are less assimilated. Because what does that do, right? It brings you down, right? It shows that you cannot be as assimilated as you need or want to be in order to fit into this dominant power structure. And then finally, this tolerance and acceptance of historical and contemporary oppression by the colonizer. And this is really important, also back to the slide that Dr. Camila presented about the role of forgetting, right? And when we forget the violence that's been inflicted on us, then we're less likely to understand this accumulation and the way it's impacting us right now. So this is a quote from a Tunisian Jewish scholar, and he refers to this as sort of the mythical portrait. And just a disclaimer, I really liked this idea when I first came upon it because I think it really expresses what it is that we're talking about, right? It's this idea that we're looking at ourselves, right? And you can think of this as like a mirror, right? Think of looking in a mirror and having it reflect back to you everything negative you've been taught to think about yourself, right? Think about the ways you were constructed as less than human, right? As someone who's a criminal, right? As inherently violent. And then think about the reasons in which you're taught to believe that that's actually true, right? And when that happens, what you then end up thinking, right? Are some of these ideas true? Is it true what they say about us, right? And we have a lot of people within our communities, our own communities, right, that are promoting these same ideas that it is indeed true. So there's this mirror, right? There's this portrait that's reflecting back to us. And so the disclaimer that I just want to add is, I really appreciated reading Albert Memmi's work. And then later found out, he's an author I used in my book as well. And later found out, I think his period of time was around sort of like the creation of Israel and sort of the earlier days of Israel's settler colonial state. And so, he does seem to have like Zionist leanings. And the reason I mentioned this is one, just out of transparency, and two, right, that there are so many layers of oppression that even someone who's working on internalized oppression, right, is blinded to the ways that he is then participating in another system of oppression, and a system of oppression that inevitably harms him as well, right? Nothing good comes of Zionism, as does nothing good come of white supremacy. So I put this question here. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, can Muslims be American and be loyal Americans, right? And the reason I just put this headline is being faithful Muslims and loyal Americans. So the Fiqh Council of North America, their whole statement was, yes, it's possible, right? What the statement didn't do was critique the idea of what does it mean to be an American? And what does it mean to be a loyal American? Why do we accept the terms and the construction of what it means to be American that the state is feeding to us? From my vantage point, I'm sure Dr. Camille and I share very similar ideas on this, right? What does being American mean? What does the United States mean? What is that history? It's a violent history, right? It's a capitalistic history. It's an exploitative history. So in my mind, no, it is not compatible to be Muslim and American. Why? Because I don't see American as a good thing in the ways that I understand the history and legacy of this country. But because of the colonial mentality We're taught to automatically respond affirmatively and excuse, right, the violence of this country in order to prove that we can be both. This is another way of proving, right? It's a way of making us more palatable to the average American, right? We believe in the same values and ideals that you do. And as Dr. Camila said, it's never enough, right? Inevitably, you'll realize when you're participating in these systems, you can be a Republican, you can wear a hijab, that's American flag, every day to work, right? You can participate and rubber stamp oppression against your community, and you will always inevitably find out that it is never going to be enough, right? The system will never accept you. And that is the point at which you have to make a decision, right? Are you going to continue down the path of internalized oppression, or are you going to challenge it and push back? So Khizr Khan, Dr. Camille and I have talked about him. And, you know, in the book that I wrote, Innocent Until Proven Muslim, I use his example, in fact, as one that's emblematic, in my opinion, of internalized oppression, in particular internalized Islamophobia. So Khizr Khan was deployed by Hillary Clinton's campaign in the 2016 elections. And while many saw this as a, you know, positive sign of representation, why was Khizr Khan deployed? Khizr Khan was deployed because he was a Purple Star father. His son was killed in the illegal war and occupation of Iraq. But yet he came to the convention to speak for her campaign, to talk about how loyal and patriotic of a Muslim he was and how proud of his son he was. Had he come, actually, he would have never been there, right? If he was there to condemn the war, to say the war was illegal, to say, I condemn war as a Muslim against other Muslims, he would have never had a platform. So what kind of mentality and internalized oppression did it take for him to appear on that stage, to identify with the oppressor and the oppressor state, and to congratulate it, right? What did that take, right? And to promote and perpetuate the mythologies that this country continues to in order to justify violence.
And I want to say, because I also referred to that moment in my chapter on racialized faith, and what I made clear was that this is not blaming Khizr Khan, right? This is sort of using this as an example to illustrate what the demands are, right, that are placed on minoritized people in this really very, very violent system. And so this is not in any way, because there have been flag hijabs, there have been flag turbans that, you know, from the Sikh community. And this is not to blame the people, right, for the ways that they're trying to like orient towards survival, right, and assimilate, right? We're just exposing, right, that there is a system at play that is pushing people, right, to act in these ways that we have to be critical of, right? But we're not blaming Khizr Khan, right? We're not saying, oh, he's a bad person. We're saying, look at what the system is doing to people, right, to their own detriment, but lifting it up as something good. We cannot accept that. I just wanted to add that point.
No, thank you. That's really important. And I think one of the things that also stands out is, and one of the reasons why, we need to challenge the system is because, when you have internalized oppression, right, and you engage in certain ways, you're not just impacting your own self, right, or your family, right? You're impacting your whole entire community. Because if you are going on a stage and saying, legitimizing this infrastructure of violent illegal war, what does it do to the community members and the community to which you belong? And so what is the pressures that are putting you in the position to do that, right? And so again, coming back to the point of this webinar, why do we then need to unlearn it, right? It is not only a matter of how it affects us personally, but it is about disentangling yourself from the violence you could be perpetuating against your own community members. And so just a final quote, he did follow up with a book called An American Family, a memoir of hope and sacrifice. And, you know, again, it's a very similar theme, right? And he talks about this idea that freedoms don't exist in the places where he came from. And I mean, there's a lot to dissect there, right? Because if you told me that, if I had said that about Egypt, I would hope someone would respond to me by saying, well, the United States is partly responsible for the reason why you don't have freedoms in Egypt, right? Like it's not that simple and basic, right? And to engage in these narratives, right, is to perpetuate the same mythologies that justify state violence. So it's really important to, you know, really think about, again, what are the narratives that we are deploying and actually which serve to sort of show how we manifested this internalized oppression. So these are, you know, another way of sort of looking at it is this is from a masjid that received funding from the Department of Homeland Security to do some counter-narrative work around countering violent extremism in particular. And, you know, I'm sure you can kind of see what may be the problem with a lot of these images, right? There's this consistent message on all of the slides that Muslims are an integral part of the American fabric and they oppose extremism in any form. If that was the case, then this statement would not have to have been made, right? And it's consistently reiterated, okay? And in the first slide on the top left, it says terrorism has no religion and I am Muslim. Well, then how come the two people in the slide are both Muslim, right? If your point was to show it has no religion, and then you're actually showing that it does have a religion, right? Dear God, tell them I'm not a terrorist. This is a really cute young Black girl who, if you hadn't put that message, you know, we don't know what people would assume. Obviously, as Dr. Camila said, there are toxins in this society, right? But they might not have defaulted to thinking she was a terrorist. But now you put that idea into people's heads by trying to counter narrate that, right? And what does that tell us about ourselves, the way we've internalized and embraced these ideas, that the only way we can challenge them is to engage in the oppressor's narrative, right? And then we'll just go to the bottom right one, where the guy is, you know, seemingly a police officer, right? And, you know, there's a lot to say about engaging specifically in institutions that are directly inflicting violence on our communities disproportionately. So this is an email, just as an example, and I know we're getting short on time, from the White House Muslim liaison, who perhaps a lot of Muslims don't even know exists as a position. And the reason I bring this email to this webinar is, you know, this email was about President Biden proclaiming Arab American Heritage Month. And, you know, it's very typical for presidents to proclaim all sorts of months, right? Whether it's Black History Month, you know, it's Muslim American History Month, whatever. I don't even know if there is a Muslim American History Month, but I don't think there is. So that's not atypical in and of itself, okay? But it is if you look at it through this lens of oppression, right? And how we might read it as internalized oppression, is that it's this idea that we should be grateful for being allowed to exist, right? We're being acknowledged, right? Finally, we've gotten to the point where the administration acknowledges our existence, right? But the problem is, in this particular correspondence, the president took the time to not only acknowledge Arab American History Month, Heritage Month, he also decided he needed to comment specifically on, of course, he didn't refer to it as a genocide that Israel's committing, but on Hamas's taking of hostages and referring to it as a brutal Hamas terrorist attack. This is in April, right? Okay, so probably about 35,000 Palestinians had been killed by that time. And yet, in acknowledging and celebrating, theoretically, right, Arab American Heritage Month, we have to talk about Hamas. So if we don't understand the ways that the state is deploying these messages, and particularly in this case, the individual Mazen Basrawi, who has since left this position, he's Egyptian and Muslim. And he's being used to make this message more palatable. We could say he has internalized oppression, and we could say that this message caters to those who also have internalized oppression, because that's the only way you could take this message at face value. And then just another quote, and I know we're running short on time. This is just a quote from an individual who runs a nonprofit organization, very prominent one called Celebrate Mercy. And he just talks about the narrative being defined for us, and saying like, well, it's unfortunate that we have to condemn all these acts of terrorism, but that's basically what we have to do at this point in time, right? And saying that it's partially our fault because we're not changing the narrative. And so this is a very colonial mentality, right? Because it's taking onus of the problem that we didn't create. Why is it that we have disproportionate access to the narratives, right? We don't control the narratives, right? We don't have that amount of power. But at the same time, the dominant master narrative teaches us that it's your responsibility to push back against these demonizing narratives that we created about you. And then the reason this is internalized oppression, of course, is because who is the messenger of that idea is another Muslim. So Muslim has embraced this idea to tell the rest of us Muslims that we need to get in check and respond in the ways that the master wants us to respond in order to solve the problem that they created. And this is sort of a video, maybe you've seen it. I think the last time I checked, it had over 315,000 views. And the reason we want to show it is, you'll see in a minute, it's just talking about some stereotypes that they want to dispel as Muslims. And so what we want you to really think about is, the way that it's being done. And is this an effective way? What does it say both about how they are presenting themselves and how they are how they think they're challenging these problematic ideas?
But I'm not forced to wear a headscarf.
I'm Muslim, but I don't wear the hijab.
I'm Muslim, but I'm not dangerous unless we're on the dance floor.
I'm Muslim, but I don't care if you're Shia or Sunni or Sufi, embrace them all. I'm Muslim, but I'm not a terrorist.
But I'm not a terrorist.
But I'm not a terrorist.
But I'm not stopped at airports because my name is Tom and I'm white.
I'm Muslim, but I'm not Arab.
I am Muslim, but I love Jews.
I'm Muslim, but I'm not an immigrant.
I'm Muslim, but I'm not homophobic.
But I'm not prejudiced towards others, but I don't hate America.
I'm Muslim, but I'm not easily offended.
I'm Muslim, but I don't look like one.
I am Muslim, but I had bacon one time on accident. It was good.
I'm Muslim, but I don't scream Allahu Akbar randomly out loud.
I am Muslim, but I wasn't the one who told kids that there was no Santa.
I'm Muslim, but you can be whatever you want to be.
I'm Muslim and I'm a feminist.
I'm Muslim and I believe in equality.
I'm Muslim and I'm descended from pilgrims on the Mayflower.
I'm Muslim and I love listening to rap music.
I am Muslim and I love Thanksgiving.
And I was born and raised in Los Angeles.
And I'm an actress. I'm Muslim and I love dancing.
And I'm a spoken word poet.
And I'm a hip hop artist.
And I ride a motorcycle.
And I love Ohio State football.
I'm Muslim and I love smiling.
I'm a Muslim and I date, even though my parents hate it.
I'm Muslim and I like to surf.
And I'm a writer.
And my best friends are not Muslim.
And I'm a convert. What?
I'm Muslim, and that doesn't contradict with being American.
I'm Muslim, and my religion teaches me to love everyone.
There's a whole series of these sort of videos that you could watch if, I don't know, you have nothing else to do in your life, I guess. But I mean, my response to this is, I'm Muslim and I will say none of these things because that's not my responsibility to refute the dominant narrative. And so again, we have to think about, what is it that makes us feel like there's an impetus for us to reject these ideas in a way that actually shows we've embraced them to a certain extent. Because if we hadn't, we wouldn't have felt the need to reject them. So we have to really be critical and really understand the conscious and unconscious processes that are involved in, right? This is, I mean, indoctrination, right? It's a form of indoctrination to teach us to hate ourselves.
Right. And so another reminder to breathe. I feel like no matter how many times I watch that video, I still cringe, because it's actually not, it's saying, yes, those things are true, but I am the exception, right? Or that's not what I believe, or, you know, having to speak on behalf of, you know, over 1 billion people, right? This is a religion of love. And, you know, so it again kind of creates this, this moment in which no one is actually learning about who you are, right? They're just saying, oh, well, that one there doesn't meet the criteria that I've been taught about them. Okay, I'll put that individual, right? Remember, the master narrative tolerates exceptions, but then puts up, right, in front of a camera, those who are marginalized in this way to say, actually, no, the master narrative is true, but there's one exception, and that looks like me, right? And so what, again, this is not blaming the people in the video. It's not blaming, right? But it's exposing, again, the ways that Dr. Maha said, the system creates these master narratives and then enlists those who are deeply impacted in negative ways by it, right? To say, well, just be the spokesperson, right, for why we can continue to tolerate these exceptions. But for the most part, they're going to be true, right, regardless. And so it really just, it should push you to think about perhaps moments in your own life, right, where you found yourself doing the work of the master narrative, right? I remember being first year of college, undergrad, saying, well, I'm Black, but I'm not Christian, and I'm Muslim, but I'm not Arab. And then at some point I was like, nobody knows who I am, right? I'm telling them everything I'm not, right? But I haven't defined who I am in an unapologetic, proactive, beautiful, proud way, right? And so they said, like, okay, you're Black, but you're not Christian. Again, establishing sort of the universality of Christianity within the African-American community. Okay, so you're Muslim, but you're not Arab. Again, establishing, yes, Islam is foreign, is Arab, is brown, is Arabic speaking, right? And they still have no idea who a Black Muslim is, right? So when we're caught in those binds, we have to understand that it is in service of the master narrative and it hurts us. So I know we are running short of time, so I'm going to breeze through the next couple of slides just to sort of get to, you know, again, the questions that we're asking to counter the master narrative, but understanding the wounds of racial of trauma, right? What happens to us when we internalize these messages? Dr. Kenneth Hardy is also a clinical psychologist, and he says that this kind of oppression is a traumatic form of interpersonal violence. It can lacerate the spirit, scar the soul, and puncture the psyche. Without a clear and descriptive language to describe this experience, those who suffer cannot coherently convey their pain, let alone heal. And this is why we're having, right, this discussion. We have to name exactly what's happening so we can begin to think about what is going to be the remedy for this pain that I'm experiencing. And he identified these 7 sort of wounds of racial trauma. And what I want to pull out from the 7 is thinking about learned voicelessness, right? Internalized evaluation, right? I'm bad, I'm unworthy. Thinking about this onslaught of messages that you receive about your unworthiness that you come to believe. And then in these last 3, this psychological homelessness, right? That every place that I am, the acceptance that I receive is conditional, right? I don't belong here. And this is what is literally, right, said to us. You don't belong here, go back to where you're from. And if anybody ever says that to me, oh, we're going to have a really fun discussion about enslavement, about Native genocide, about the rape of African women, right? So when we hear these things, what happens though is says you are in a perpetual, vulnerable, precarious state because you do not belong here, right? And that wears on us mentally and emotionally as well. And then finally, this orientation towards survival, right? Either I have to align with the oppressor, I feel ashamed of the people who look like me, or I feel sort of split always, right? That I'm performing, I'm pretending to be someone that I'm not, or this feigned subservience, right? Like, oh, I'll just say the things that I think they want to hear and that'll help me get by. It doesn't. But the culmination of all of these experiences, right? We began by looking at how are we born into the world with these beautiful, vibrant lungs that we can breathe in, all of sort of the potential and possibilities. But over the course of our lives, our lungs look more like this, right? The toxins that we've ingested, the messages that we've received, and then how we begin to feel about ourselves. And we have to breathe anyway, right? We take in the toxins, we think, no, I'll just hold my breath. But that's not the solution. So we take sort of inspiration from many, for me, especially Black feminist scholars, right? Writers, poets, right? People who are thinking about the condition of marginalized people, right? And Alice Walker said, healing begins where the wound was made. We have to understand the wound. We have to understand the pain, give language to it, and then think about what are our choices, what decisions can we make? James Baldwin, again, another just really deep, wise scholar whose words seem just timeless. He says, right, to this wound that we take in, all you're ever told in this country about being Black is that it is terrible. It is a terrible thing to be. Now, in order to survive this, you have to really dig down into yourself and recreate yourself according to no image which yet exists in America. You have to impose, in fact. He said, this may sound very strange. You have to decide who you are and force the world to deal with you, not with this idea of you. So this goes to the counter narrative, right? Think about, who am I? Who am I striving to be? Who am I connected to? Breathe. And then there may not be models, right, of who you are becoming, but you have to firmly and unequivocally reject the master narrative, right? You are worthy, you have value, you are human, right? You are flawed. You don't have to be a perfect minority person, right? And so when we're trying to get to what feels like the truth of who we are, which is that we are valued and worthy, right? Again, taking inspiration from another Black scholar and poet, writer, right? There are so many silences to be broken, right? The silences around what we internalize of this oppressive experience. And we try to find the words to say what is the truth, right? Not regurgitate the words of the master narrative. So our approach at Muslim Wellness Foundation, our approach to healing is these 4 steps, right? And this is what we've been doing, right? Recognizing what oppression is, how it operates, how it exists, what is the trauma and the wounds that we experience, reflecting on it, right? Not just saying, oh, those are nice things to know, but I don't really think that happens to me. I'm not really impacted, right? We are, right? We're trying to figure out, to what degree have I been harmed? And then that will tell me to what degree I must surround myself with the support necessary to continue to heal, right? And that being an ongoing process, right? Not a destination. But then we constantly resist, right? Ingesting in more, right, of that poison that's around us. And throughout this process, we celebrate who we are, because nobody else is going to do that for us, right? So we recognize the oppression, we reflect on its impact on us, we resist in a way that Bell Hooks writes about, that our resistance doesn't have to be something that's like billboard sized and active and out in the street and public protest, right? Resistance can also just be refusal, to accept that you are unworthy, period, right? And then you celebrate, right, your strengths, your gifts, the people that allow you to exist, right, in your full beauty. And so what I want to pull out from this cycle of liberation is thinking about this stage right here, right? We're just going to focus. This is what we're doing right now. It's understanding, right? Consciousness raising, right? It's thinking about, how do I understand myself? What has happened? What are those incidents that have caused some discomfort, that has made me wonder, that have really challenged me to think, who taught me to hate myself, right? This is the stage that we're in. But at the core of this, right, I just want to point this out, that it is also a practice of love, right? It is about developing skills, right? Strategy to be effective, and to know that there is a firm belief that we can succeed because white supremacy is not inevitable, right? And experiencing something of joy and passion and compassion for who we are collectively, and that we are not alone. So when we begin to wake up, right, to those incidents, the dissonance, and we get ready, right, we're thinking and we're engaged in conversations, we breathe throughout, because this is going to take us all of our lives, right? It's not like, oh, I unlearned white supremacy. No, that doesn't exist anymore. I mean, if only, right? But it is the continual process of saying, I refuse to be governed, right? And to be manipulated by the master narrative when I can tell my own story, right? And it is one that is compelling and is beautiful. It can be ordinary, average, right? It doesn't have to be, right? We don't have to be these extraordinary people, right? We can just do everyday people kind of things. And that is also really, really beautiful. So the counter story is a story of self-definition. It is meant to help us repair the damage, right? It is meant to help us be conscious of the ways that we can almost default back into that kind of subservience and feelings of being diminished. But we know that there's an alternative, right? And that really powerfully happens when we do that together, right? We share stories with each other, right? What do I need to know about who I am? What do I need to understand about who you are? Because those are the stories that are not told. So what we want to leave you with is really a question, right? Where does your story begin, right? Everyone has a story. We've talked about what the master narrative is and what it does, how it operates. And then we also have stories that must be told for our own health, right? For our own health. And Toni Morrison says that you choose the theme, right? You be your own story, you choose the theme. Very similar to James Baldwin saying, listen, you force them to deal with not the idea of you or what they've constructed, but who you are, right? Toni Morrison says, you invent the language to say who you are and what you mean, and then you tell them. And again, going back to James Baldwin, he says, all art, right, storytelling, narrative work is a kind of confession, right? And all artists, if they are to survive, are forced to tell the whole story and to vomit the anguish up. Tell your whole entire complete story and get that toxin, right, out of you, right? Because it does poison from the inside. It corrodes from the inside. And, you know, maybe we need a little practice, right? We're not quite sure how to do it, or are we bragging, or, you know, are we just being the exception? No, again, we can be ordinary, right? We can be so ordinary and average and mundane and boring. And that is just so fine, right? But we vomit the anguish up, right? The anguish is the anguish of that wound, right? The wounds that we've experienced personally, but also across generations, right? Connected to the people that we call home. So take a deep breath. We have some work to do. But the good news is we can do it. It has been done, right? And I always remind myself of this. I'm a descendant of enslaved people. right, who are no longer, right? We can put an asterisk. That's the talk for another conversation, right? But enslaved in the ways that my ancestors fought to be free, right? Fought to flee from that kind of violence. Perhaps they would have never imagined a fourth grade granddaughter named Camila Mukmin Oseguera, right? Who is now, right, born and raised in a Muslim family. My ancestors were predominantly Christian, African Methodist. And I still think about that, right? Like there is another story that is being told, and it is about the continuation of a legacy of freedom seeking, right? Of being able to tell the truth as we know it, and to think about what more must be done so that, you know, if we're blessed, perhaps our descendants are still, right? Perhaps they're still fighting to tell the truth, right? But it's a different context, it's a different set of circumstances, and they feel more emboldened by the work that we've begun today. So this is how we want to conclude. And Toni Morrison, again, is just, these are names that I think are really important as we think about people who are storytellers, right? Who observe the world and people and give us language. And Toni Morrison wrote an essay called Rootedness, Ancestor as Foundation. And in that essay, she said, this is not about just you and me. This is about the village. And if it's not about the village, if it's not about the community, if it's not about telling all of our stories, said, then it ain't about nothing, right? So it's not just what can I do for myself so I can be okay, but when I am well, when I am seeking truth and freedom, it also does something really brilliant for the communities that I'm a part of. So we want to leave you with this idea from Bell Hooks in an essay she wrote called Home Place, A Site of Resistance. And what she describes is the feeling of home, right? How do we, when we're constantly inundated with messages saying you don't belong, you're ugly, you're lazy, you're inferior, you're barbaric, you're evil, you're dangerous, right? Where do we find a place, right? What do we construct for ourselves so we can begin to construct a healthier, truthful story about who we are? So she says, this is the place, this home place is the place where we can resist, right? Where we can affirm one another. We can heal from the wounds that we experience. We have the opportunity to grow and develop, to nurture our spirits, okay? This is the home place that we create for ourselves. We don't ask the oppressor, we don't ask the colonizer to create a home place for us. That will never happen, right? And if they said that they are, don't believe them. Oh, this is a safe space. You're lying, right? And history will back us up. So we create home place for ourselves. So we want to ask you this then, okay? Bell Hooks said that a home place, a place where you're nurtured and affirmed and you can rest and heal, is a place where your soul gets something of nourishment, right? Of ease, of rest. So we want you, as we sort of come to the end of this conversation, to think of a place or person you call home, okay? And with that person or in that place, that community perhaps, you feel loved and cherished and respected, right? And protected, right? You are nurtured, okay? So try to recall to mind a person, a place, or maybe it's an experience, right, of home where you feel loved and cherished, okay? So when you're in that place or with that person that you call home and you're loved in this way, what color do you see? Don't overthink it. Something's going to come to mind, I promise. And when you're at home and you're loved in this way and you're cherished and protected, what is the texture of that love? Right? The question that Malcolm X asked us at the beginning, he asked us in 1962, and we're still asking ourselves, He said, who taught you to hate the texture of your hair? And now we're asking, when you are home and you are loved and you are affirmed, what is the texture of that love? What does it feel like? If you could put it between your fingertips, what does that feel like? And when you're home and loved in this way, what does this smell like? Right? We're going to use all of our senses to kind of remind us of what we deserve, what we've experienced, and what we can do more of. So what is that smell that comes to mind? And I want you to also think about what it sounds like. Right? I think of children laughing, right? Sort of you can hear just, kind of like the busyness of a family, like preparing for dinner, right? Just the sort of the sound of people just being, right, with one another. So when we're thinking about how it feels, the texture, how it sounds, what it smells like, right? That is our home place. That is the place that we can recall in our minds when the master narrative is really grinding us, right? Think of your home place. Think about being rooted in your ancestors as foundation. Think about the counter story that you can tell that affirms who you are, right? And it doesn't begin with the presuppositions of the master narrative. Oh, I'm Muslim, but I'm not a terrorist. No. It begins with, I'm Muslim, I like to bake, right? Like, who are you, right? Who loves you? Who are you connected to? Those are the stories that we want to tell. And finally, this image some of you may have seen before is Sankofa. It means it is not wrong to go back for that which you have forgotten. Because one of the elements of how oppression operates is that it causes us to forget and to pretend, right? So we want to go back, right? Rootedness, right? Ancestor as foundation, the stories of who we are that are beautiful and affirming, right? This is just the beginning, right? Remember, the cycle of liberation begins with a waking up, right? An understanding, an introspection, a consciousness raising. And this is what we wanted to offer today, right? Some language, some framing, some understanding, and a challenge to continue to ask yourself questions, to reflect, to go back for that which you have forgotten, because the master narrative does that to us, and begin to think about what can you gather together for yourself that begins to plant the seed for a really healthy, vibrant, beautiful, amazing story to grow. So take a deep breath. And this is an actual picture. This is a picture that I took. So I'm very proud of myself. But it's a picture of the coastline of a tiny little island called Nevis in the Leeward Islands in the Caribbean. And my father's family is from this little small island. And I think about how many years, it took 100 years from my great-grandmother immigrating from this island to New York to my family returning, was a space of 100 years. Right? So when we take a deep breath and we think about the stories that can be told, it can bring us back to a place where we feel restored and we feel seen and we feel understood. This is all possible. And so we're inviting you to do that as well. I'm going to let Dr. Maha close us out.
Thank you all so much for being here in the space with us and, sharing this 95-minute session with us. Really hope that you got what you needed out of it, have some ideas and thoughts on, what you'd like to do with it, friends and family you'd like to share this information with, and, just really think about, yourself in this moment and having compassion towards yourself, right? This is not an easy topic. And I know a lot of us are doing the work, right, to challenge injustice externally. And that is even more difficult, right, when we also take on the work of challenging the oppression we're facing internally and within our communities. So really, again, appreciating your time on this Sunday. And, we hope to have, more communication with all of you and to think about some follow-ups that we can do on this topic of internalized oppression. So again, thank you so much. And honestly, it's been an honor to be with you, Dr. Camila, as always. And I'm sure everyone agrees. So it's been such an honor and a pleasure and really excited for next steps.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm going to encourage everyone to buy a copy of Dr. Maha's book, Innocent Until Proven Muslim. Right, I've got my little bookmarks and my highlights. But it's Islamophobia, the War on Terror, and the Muslim Experience since 9/11. And also for those who are perceived to be Muslim that experience, these kinds of just aggressions and violence as well. And we're thinking about ways to, again, create spaces for community where we can talk about what this means and how it feels in a way that is also generative, right? That we have choices that we make. And again, as a descendant of people who were always freedom seekers, there's so much that is possible when we imagine, right? And then we set our feet, right, towards that goal. So we invite you to continue with us on that journey and certainly invite your feedback. This recording will go out to everyone. So, in your own time and at your own pace, you can revisit some of what we shared today and talk to us, right? We want to know how you're doing and what you're thinking and what more you might want to learn, right? God willing, inshallah. All right, beautiful people. Have a good rest of your day. Breathe. If there's nothing else that you take from this conversation, is that remind yourself to breathe. You are alive. You have choices, and you are worthy and beautiful of all of the possibilities that might be at your disposal. All right. Take care. Assalamu alaikum.